One of the most deeply pushed narratives of the gaming community's history is that the PlayStation stomped Nintendo consoles, that the PlayStation destroyed Nintendo consoles, that the PlayStation was way more relevant and way more popular than Nintendo consoles. And that has remained true for the last 25 years, right? That has always been the pervasive narrative. And I've always been pushing back against this, especially during the PS4 era, but it's becoming more and more apparent with the PS5 and beyond that PlayStation simply can't compete. Right now, we're in this kind of phase where people don't want to admit that like the PS3 wasn't very good and that it was stomped by the Wii. Even now, you'll see people try to say that like the PS3 won that generation when even like industry analysts were forced to concede that between the highly successful Wii and the DS that Nintendo dominated that gen, right? So much so they had to work overdrive to try and tank the 3DS and Wii U, right? With that in mind, right? With that all that in mind, like what about the PS2? What was with this generation? Because obviously the PlayStation 2 was the highest selling console ever, right? No. Okay, what actually happened is that Sony, much like they did with Horizon Zero Dawn just recently, faked their numbers to 152 million to eclipse the DS, right? If you actually look at like the sales for the PS2, you'll notice they don't actually make any sense. How like the console kept selling, way into like 2010, 2012 after the DS ended production. Like this was Sony's attempts at like remaining on top and remaining relevant. Like the official excuse is that like the console was so popular in third world countries that they kept putting games out on it. But in reality, the console was never popular to begin with. The issue with the PS2 was that it came out in an era before DVD players were common, before people started like really getting into games, before people started like realizing that the PlayStation brand wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. Like the PS2 was incredibly astroturfed, right? Everyone was talking about this thing, how it was like how it could play movies on discs, how it had all these features, how it could do all of this. But when it comes to the actual games, and I do think this is really important, nobody really remembers or talks about any of them. Now, there are classic games on PS2, stuff like Kingdom Hearts, God Hand, Shadow of the Colossus, but Metal Gear Solid 3, great games on PS2 even. But the vast majority of them could be better on GameCube. And I do think that is the thing here is that these games inexplicably did not get GameCube releases. And there are even a handful of examples, Soul Calibur I think being the most prominent, where a GameCube game came out, did extraordinarily well on the console, and then magically the next title in the series was PlayStation exclusive, right? It happened to Tails, it happened to Soul Calibur, it happened to a lot of games back then, right? Sony was money hatting these studios to get these games off of Nintendo consoles and onto PlayStation. And people always like to insist it's because of like the popularity of the console or like the disc-based form, the disc size or capacity is the excuse now because it's generally accepted that the GameCube was more. People like to point to the image of PS2 being a more mature console, but in reality, these games would not have sold more on PS2 than they would have on GameCube, right? Like the reality was that the GameCube was competing with the PS2 in spite of not having anywhere near as many hardware sales because the games were so popular, right? GameCube fans have stuck with the console for 20 years. Meanwhile, like the PS2, the 3, and the 4 have gone completely forgotten. Name a single PlayStation game in the past 20 years that has retained its relevancy as much as Super Smash Bros. Melee, right? Not a single one. Okay, nothing even comes close. And that's not even going into like other GameCube games that have been revitalized in recent years through re-releases, Pikmin 1 and Metroid Prime Remastered. Like, I would say Metroid Prime Remastered was one of the best games released last year. Like, it is sad, positively sad, how well that game has aged and how much it stomps games that come out today, right? It is legit the peak of gaming, right? One of the best games ever produced, for sure. And, back when that game came out, it was downplayed. Just like Luigi's Mansion, just like Pikmin, just like Wave Race Blue Storm, just like F-Zero GX, these amazing games that basically had no competitors on PS2, were just downplayed and ignored by corrupt gaming journalists and shills, right? Oh, but it doesn't have GTA. GTA was one game, okay? Like, that's the reality, is that GTA could not carry the PS2, right? Silent Hill could not carry the PS2, right? These games had no reason to not be on GameCube. The only reason they were on PS2 was because of exclusivity deals. And without those deals, without Sony money hatting Final Fantasy, without Sony money hatting Capcom, without all of this, like, these games could not compete. And the reality is, stuff like Resident Evil 4 was better because it was GameCube exclusive, because the GameCube was simply a better gaming console, right? Just like how the Wii was better than the PS3 and the 360, right? Just like how the Wii U was better than the PS4 and the Xbox One, and just how the Switch is better than the PS5, the Xbox Series X, high-end gaming PCs, the ROG Ally, the Steam Deck, mobile, iOS, Android, good old games, like whatever service you can acknowledge, right? Nintendo has always been at the top. They have always done the best because they've always produced the best games. They've always managed to stay extraordinarily relevant. And the only reason the narrative managed to, I would argue, reach its apex in the GameCube era, right? Like, the idea that Nintendo was old and tired and couldn't compete, it was because Sony was still riding off that, like, 90s hype. 90s Sony was, like, at the top of their game in regards to, like, their control over the industry and the propaganda and, like, the way people viewed their products. But increasingly, the company is being seen as a joke, right? They are falling off the map. Like, the most relevant thing they've done in years is produce the Zelda movie, a Nintendo product. How insane is that? Like, the only time anybody talks positively about Sony is if they're working on a Nintendo property. That's crazy to think about. Like, when you actually look at what Naughty Dog is doing, what Sony Santa Monica is doing, what any of their subsidiaries are doing, like, there is nothing of value there. There are no games. Not on PS5, not on PS4, not on PS3, and not on PS2, right? I used to think that, like, the PS2 was a pretty solid console, but, like, seeing how basically every game gets re-released on other platforms, on PC, on Switch, on better platforms, and seeing just how, like, none of them are all that spectacular. Devil May Cry, Final Fantasy X, um, the Silent Hill games, a ton of Resident Evil games, right? Like, you really start to realize that, like, the vast majority of the hype regarding the PS2 was all just astroturfing. Like, it was not legit. It was not coming from real serious gamers. And I do think that's why increasingly more and more people are looking back on the Xbox fondly, because it was better. Why so many people look back on the GameCube more fondly? Because it was better. Why people are looking back on, like, the DS and the Game Boy Advance and the Game Boy Color, right? Like, they were better platforms, right? They simply had better video games. Nobody cares about the DVD functionality. Nobody cares about the music player. Nobody cares about, like, the disc capacity or, like, whatever, right? The PS2 was the worst out of the three platforms that gen, right? The PSP was a disaster as well. And the issue is that there is a very there's a very dedicated audience of man children who just don't want to admit it because they were told that the PS2 was the best. It was the only one that their parents bought them or whatever, and they just don't understand just how much better the GameCube was, just how much better the Xbox was, just how much better like non-Sony products are in general. Like the PS2 simply could not compete or keep itself relevant long term.